I'll go with Eric Blake. Why don't we? Okay, so Eric Blake, hey Bill. Supposedly JFK was considering a variety of space-based ambitions before setting on putting a man on the moon and bringing him safely back to Earth. One of the alternatives was a permanent space station in orbit. Had Kennedy got that, had Kennedy gone that route instead of the moon landing, what do you think the space race and our space program in general would have looked like afterwards? It would have looked like nothing. Um, Earth orbit is extremely useful, and you can do a lot if you have an actual real facility in Earth orbit. Potentially could have done a lot with the International Space Station. When they were talking about it and selling the International Space Station, one of the biggest selling points, at least to me, was that it was going to be a place where you could assemble interplanetary rockets that didn't have to have the oomph to get out of the Earth's atmosphere and gravity. You could build delicate things like the LEM in Earth orbit and then fly them not just to the moon and back, but around the solar system. It would be an assembly point. It made a lot of sense. It was great. And it wasn't until I started at PJTV, so it'd be maybe 2008, 2009, interviewing an astronaut when I finally realized that the space station is useless for that. It's useless because the inclination of the space station is so high. The inclination of the solar system has a plane, and that plane is called the ecliptic. Pretty much all of the planets, with the exception of Pluto, which isn't a planet anymore, lie within a degree or two of this flat plane. So imagine it's like a giant LP or something. So the solar system is flat, and they're flat in a band called the ecliptic. Now the Earth is tilted 23 degrees to that. So the equator of the Earth and the ecliptic are 23 degrees out of each other. But that's manageable, and it also depends on time of year, I would imagine, when you're launching. But in any event, it is a very, very, very energy-intensive maneuver to change the inclination of something once it's in space. It takes a fair amount of energy and fuel. So imagine my surprise when I find out in 2009, after being a space buff for 40 years, 50, that the International Space Station was put into an orbit where the inclination is so high that it would require more energy to take that inclination out and then launch it into the solar system than it would to probably launch it from Earth. And I was just gobsmacked by this, absolutely gobsmacked. And I said to this astronaut, he was NASA representative, flown in the space shuttle. I said, "Is that right?" He said, and he was kind of backtracking. I said, "Well, there's a lot of things the space station does, but it is so far out of the ecliptic. Its inclination is so high that it's useless for planetary missions." Yeah, pretty much. Well, why is that? And it turned out that the answer is we had to get it into that kind of an inclination so that the Russians could get to it. Because it used to be the phrase space station was going to be freedom. That was the name of the space station. And it was a lot more ambitious than ISS. And then we decided we're going to try and do it on the cheap, like we did the shuttle on the cheap and Apollo 1 capsule on the cheap and all the rest of it. And so we decided, well, we'll get the Russians to help us put this thing up there. And I don't know what percentage of the space station was built by Russian boosters. I know that it's been supplied almost exclusively by Russian boosters, but in terms of construction, I don't know. But so it's almost like you had to destroy the space station in order to save it. It's useless. And so really, when you think about it, after Apollo, you had Skylab and Apollo Soyuz are just placeholders. But basically, for the 30 years that the middle part of my life when I was expecting to see some real progress, what I saw were space shuttle missions and then space shuttle missions to build and then service the space station. And when you ask people why you needed a space shuttle, they say because you need to have a way to get to the space station. And then when you ask them, why do you have to have a space station? They say, well, because you needed a place for the shuttle to go. So yeah, 51 degrees. Ladco 77 says 51 degrees orbital inclination. That's more than half. Um, and it's politics. It's politics. So so if we had stayed in Earth orbit, Eric, and we'd done it right. Look, going to the moon was important. It was the pinnacle of human history, and whether or not we improve on it remains to be seen. But there's something about a moon landing that is dramatic and achievable. You put your foot down on another world, you plant a flag. If you build a space station, you're essentially, I mean, we went from Mercury with 1 man to Gemini with 2 men to Apollo with 3 men, and we're going, to 7 men, although Skylab only had 3 men crews. So staying in Earth orbit doesn't do you much good, especially if you're in such an inclination you can't do anything. Now, if you want to ask me what I would have done with a space program, if I'd been in charge of it, what I would have done is I would have gone to the moon more or less the way we did, for the prestige and for the learning experience for the curve. And then I would assemble in Earth orbit a space station that is lying exactly on the ecliptic, exactly on the plane of the solar system. And from that place, I start assembling parts of vehicles that would be brought up from Earth on shuttle missions or whatever the case may be. And then these reusable vehicles could be used to just kind of give you a little push and get you out to the moon with no trouble. Venus is somewhat more difficult, but not a lot more difficult. Mars is tougher than Venus, Jupiter's tougher than Mars, and so on. But then you'd have an actual place. If I could have anything right now, I will tell you this: if I had a choice between a Mars landing and a one-off Mars landing and a permanent lunar base, I would take the lunar base in a heartbeat. You have to. You can't. When you understand that 98% of the work exploring the solar system, 8% of the total energy needed to go to put men on Pluto, 97% of that total energy consists of getting you from the ground into Earth orbit, low Earth orbit. And once you get up there, everything else is pretty low energy, slow, but it'll get you there. So that's the nut that has to be cracked, is getting things into Earth orbit. And we tried it with the space shuttle, which was exceedingly complex and very complex for a truck. I think the future looks like SpaceX. The fact that you can recover the boosters and not throw away those engines every single launch is enormous. That's a real game changer. I don't know how much fuel they don't get to use. Needless to say, if you're going to have a booster that returns to its launch point or to a barge out in the Atlantic, you have to use some fuel for that re-entry burn, and then some fuel for the actual deceleration, then some more fuel for the landing. So if you're going to have to save that fuel to land the booster, that's less fuel you can use to boost. But I don't know what the percentage is, but I'll bet it's probably 7-8%. I wouldn't think it's too much. And SpaceX has done it. I personally like air vehicles. I'd like to see something like the Dream Chaser, which looks like the space shuttle's baby brother, much smaller than the space shuttle, but it's basically a winged vehicle with ceramic tiles and stuff. And it'd be nice to be able to get crews up there and fly them back down. But if you're able to reuse the capsule, the Dragon capsule, then you're just talking about fairings and things like that. So the reason, I am so sorry, excuse me, I apologize. The reason I'm convinced that that SpaceX is going to do it is not. It's not because I've seen them land the boosters. Although when I saw them land them two simultaneously on that first Falcon Heavy launch, it blew my mind. That was the most impressive thing I've seen since the moon landing. But the reason they're going to do it is pretty simple. The reason that SpaceX is going to pull it off is because their recovery barge is called Of Course I Still Love You. That's the official name of the barge. It's right there painted on the circle. Of course I still love you. If you are able to have that much fun, then nothing can stop you. Nothing. Because when you get down to it, everything great that's ever happened in the world happened because somebody thought it would be cool. The iPhone is here, smartphones are here because they thought it would be cool. The 65 Mustang changed the automobile industry because somebody thought it would be cool. And all of this stuff is because you think it would be cool. When you get to the point where you're dealing with Lockheed Martin, Northrop, conglomerate, they're not doing it anymore because it's cool. They're doing it because it's money making. I have no problem with this at all. In fact, I'm very, very proud of companies like Boeing and Lockheed and all the rest. But they're certainly not doing it to be cool. And as I've mentioned before, the idea that Boeing or Lockheed would test out a new launch system by launching a red convertible into space with a mannequin behind the wheel, the top down, playing David Bowie, although not into space somehow because there's no sound, but nevertheless David Bowie on the radio, and then on the navigation screen of the car the words "Don't Panic," which is a pop reference to, a kind of a space comedy. The idea of Lockheed doing that, the chance of it, is zero. And that's why you won't ever get real innovation from Lockheed and Boeing. I'm going to exclude the Skunk Works because the Skunk Works and Phantom Works are like another company I have some familiarity with, and that's Scaled Composites. Bert, I did, Sarge. Thank you very much. Bert Rutan built Scaled Composites because he thought it would be cool, and Bert Rutan put men into outer space. He did what the Mercury program did, and he did it much more elegantly, and he did it for $20 million, maybe, or 30, of Paul. What's his name? I want to say Paul Ryan. Andy, the co-founder of Microsoft. Paul, that's going to come to me here. Paul Allen, thank you. Now I'm going to get 9 answers. Paul Allen, thank you very much. Paul Allen put up $30 million, and Bert Rutan built a space program. He didn't just build a spaceship, he built a space program. He built a launch system, built a ground control system, built the orbital vehicle, did the training, had to build the simulators, all of it. And Bert did it because he thought it would be fun. And Paul Allen put the money into it because he thought it would be fun. And that's why it worked. And that's the only thing that'll work. China is incapable of doing this. China is incapable of innovating in space because the idea of the Chinese naming their landing pad, "Of Course I Still Love You," is inconceivable. And it's inconceivable for the European Union to do. And it's inconceivable for the U.S. government to do. It's inconceivable. But if you are that loose and that flexible and having that much fun, then anything's possible. And yeah, thank you very much, Ladko. I remember saying that. It was a nice thing to say about a friend of mine. I said, I was talking about Bert Rutan, and I said the only thing Bert Rutan couldn't design is a box for him to think outside of. I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, it has to be fun, and And the people I've known a few people who've become millionaires, not a whole lot of them. But the ones that I know all started out with nothing or next to nothing and ended up making a ton of money, but their goal was not to make a ton of money. Their goal was to do something that they thought would be cool and have fun with. And it seems to me, like we have cornered the market on this. I don't know anywhere else in the world where this kind of thing is done and possible. And God knows the left is trying everything they can to make sure it doesn't happen here. And so is the government. And NASA's job is to make sure now that people do not get into space. That's what I heard from my friends up at X-Corp, trying to get a permit to fly a mission, just looking out the window, and just the paperwork they had to go through to deal with NASA is just insane. And likewise, when NASA builds something, the provenance of every bolt has to be so meticulously researched and checked and make sure it's not being imported from certain countries. And so just to put a bolt on something. And they were going up at SpaceX, and X-Corp, and they would just say, well, why don't we just go to the hardware store and get the bolt? That's how you do it. So anyway, it is 7:38, and I am going to have to bug out because I am falling asleep at the wheel here. I've got a fair amount of script editing to do before I can go home.